It is really wonderful to be back with everybody, and hopefully the next time we can be together in the sanctuary at the church. I know for sure that this is not the way that any of us thought that we would be spending the holiday weekend. And I can tell you that personally, this is not the way I ever imagined coming back after 2.5 years to the church to be with you. But the pandemic has changed everything. We all know that. It's really turned everything upside down, including maybe some of the understandings that we've had prior to the pandemic. And not that we needed COVID to help us realize this, but it's been a reminder of the best and the worst in and about us as a larger community, and of course, as a nation. We've been reminded of the selfless giving that we see everywhere, but also reminded of the selfish taking. We've seen thoughtful leadership as well as destructive denial. I mean, these things are not new. People are flawed and broken, as well as heroic and well-meaning. But it does remind me of an illustration that I heard several months ago. This person that was speaking to us said that our nation is like a big house that we all live in. And underneath this house, there are 3 rivers that are always running. The rivers' names are unity, racism, and exceptionalism. All 3 of these rivers were given shape and direction by North American colonizing settlers. Now, sometimes the waters rise and sometimes they fall, depending on leadership and demands on the era, but the waters are always running. There is always enough water in each river so that there is a current. Occasionally, these rivers rise so high that they flood the landscape, they flood the house, and they do damage, as, in my opinion, we have recently seen. Now, since leaving my ministry with you, I've been writing and speaking about the ways that Unitarian Universalism has interacted with these 3 rivers of reality, of how we have been soaked in these waters. And there are remnants and effects from these floodwaters that are carried around in backpacks, the proverbial baggage that sometimes people talk about that we have inherited from our families, from our country, that are always there that we carry, some more heavy than others. Sometimes when all of this gets unpacked from our baggage, from our backpack, what's there, the contents, can startle us. Let me tell you about a personal example of a realization and insight that I had. I had the opportunity several years ago to go to Hawaii, and while I was in Honolulu, Karen and I visited the Bishop Museum. And on the 2nd floor, if I remember right, the exhibit is about the history of Hawaii. And as you move from each exhibit to the next, the glass enclosed exhibits, they tell a different story. And one of them was about the 1893 coup, the overthrow of the monarchy of the Queen. And it names the US ambassador to Hawaii at the time. They called them ministers at that time. The minister from the United States to Hawaii was Minister John Stevens. And as I stood there, I had a moment of cosmic embarrassment, my language, a moment of cosmic embarrassment, where suddenly I felt as though everyone around me knew what was going on inside of me, and I was humbled. I was really, in a way, humiliated. Because, see, I knew about John Stevens. John Stevens was indeed a minister. He was a Unitarian Universalist minister who had served a decade in the state of Maine. He really had a very good ministry while he was there. Turns out he was just one of our faith ancestors who had an imperial role in colonization and exploitation of indigenous peoples. Just one of the many Unitarian Universalists who had been baptized in the waters of racism and exceptionalism while giving lip service to the river called unity. I mean, how did that happen? I mean, how, why? These are not the kind of stories we like to tell in our history classes with especially newcomers. It's because the theology that the liberal Christians shaped that is the Unitarian Universalism in the 18th and 19th centuries, as a response to Puritan Calvinism, it was good. I mean, it was really fine theology. And it was culturally elitist and racist. And the only unity it supported was a unity of like-minded followers. It was a theology that drew from and fed the rivers of racism and exceptionalism. And it would support the disproportionately large number of Unitarians and Universalists who helped to colonize, sometimes leading in the colonization and exploitation of indigenous people throughout the North Pacific. Again, this is not the kind of history we like to talk about as a nation, but in particular as a faith community. And yet, I believe if we don't recognize it, if we don't name it, we put ourselves at great risk. Isabel Wilkerson, in her groundbreaking book, Caste, provides an illustration that speaks to this. And maybe it's an illustration that some of you can appreciate more than others. For those of you who are homeowners, you may remember a time of learning when there was something so basic, so foundational wrong in the house that you had to have it repaired, oftentimes at great expense. Oftentimes, the damage that occurs was not done by you. In fact, it could have been by owners, several previous owners, much sooner than you're purchasing the home, maybe even generations ago, depending on how old the house you live in is. In other words, you've inherited the problems and you cannot ignore them. You either repair the damage or live with the risks of it growing worse, maybe even of something fundamentally happening to your house, like it falling in upon you. This house, says Wilkerson, is the United States of America. And I say it's our Unitarian Universalism, where the river's waters have done the damage. We hope the waters will recede. And when they do, we can maybe make some repairs, some restoration. How do we begin? Well, like a lot of projects of this sort, we need to be on the same page to start with, which will require some learning, some unlearning, and then some learning again. That means some study and self-study are required, and this is hard. I mean, this is challenging work. Perhaps you've heard the adage, which I think is true, diagnosis determines treatment. This involves unpacking our imperial self, which will not be an easy task, but we really don't have any choice. Fortunately, we do not have to do it alone. There are places where we can turn to get some direction, some help. One of those sources is something that I had the opportunity to be part of. If you go to the UUA.org website and you go to the international department, you can find there a webinar that I helped with entitled Unitarian Universalism's Colonial Legacy. Are we an imperial faith? And over the 4 or 5 sessions that we met with the different people who were part of the webinar, we began to unpack our theology, our history, to look at what was in our backpack, the ways that we had drawn from those 3 rivers, and begin to form some conclusions, especially about how we might be able to move forward. I'm thinking about something that John said last week about restoring and reforming, and a line from an old song in the 70s came to me, that there is something happening here and what it is very clear. Civil rights leader and activist William J. Barber put these words to it: we are in the adolescent stages of a third Reconstruction. People are beginning to wake up in some ways and beginning to see that something is at stake when it comes to the very heart and soul of America. And I would add, to the very heart and soul of Unitarian Universalism, our faith. And so another place we can turn to for help is congregational study. Just in June, The UUA Commission on Institutional Change released 3 years of work called Widening the Circle of Concern. It's available online. Again, if you go to the UUA website, you can find it. There's also a study guide. And I would hope that every congregation, that UUCA would take advantage of this opportunity as a way with some direction to look at the recommendations, to look at the history that they lay out and see how it interacts with the direction that our congregation wants to move. Perhaps you too have read that this year's election saw the largest voter turnout in 120 years. I mean, that's remarkable. That is 120 years ago when Republican William McKinley beat Democrat William Jennings Bryan. And one of the issues on the ballot in 1900 was the American story and who gets to shape it and tell it, who gets to write it. Sound familiar? America had just annexed Hawaii in 1898, had gone to war with Spain and was about to colonize the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico. And voters overwhelmingly, by electing McKinley, said, yes, we are a colonizing nation. We are an imperial power. They seem to be saying that we too have been baptized in the river's waters of racism and exceptionalism, and will now seek to unify our nation and the world behind a powerful message of America first. So in the reading, Zadie Smith asks, what do we want history to do to us? She doesn't ask, what do we want history to teach us? I think she doesn't ask that, use that word teach, because that's too passive. She asks, what do we want it to do to us? And I'd like to personalize that, take it one step further and ask, what do you want history to do to you? For the moment, the river's waters appear to have stopped rising, and we have a window of opportunity. Hopefully they will recede and give us a chance to start repairs on our home, on our nation, on our faith. Let us begin by unpacking the imperial self so we can all see its contents. Then we can join together and we can move toward restoration. Let this be our hope. Let this be our plan. Let us do it together. It is so good to be back with you. Amen.